It's not that I don't think Rayman 2 is great. Maybe this is one of those you had to be there moments, but visually, this was one of the most groundbreaking things to come out of the 3D revolution brought about by Mario 64, saying, hey, why don't we paint those textures? Why don't we conceptualize some of those amazing looking characters with some of the best designs for pirate enemies you've seen in your life? And hey, while we're at it, let's have them act! The music, the style, the scale, visually and conceptually, Rayman 2 is one of my favorites, but as a game, and purely on a personal level, it's complicated. My issue is that the experience sort of stops at its look. It's a really interesting scenario with this amazing opening, and it's intriguing and funny and surprising, and then, after an encounter with the King of Nightmares resulting in what I can only assume made someone very happy, it sort of never gets better. Ray 2's boggy swamp vibes wear a bit thin on me as it goes on, starts to feel like one really long level, and even with a couple neat gimmicks thrown in, there's very little variation in tone, comedy, and drama to match the fantastic premise. The final boss is a complete fumble as far as I'm concerned. Sure, very atmospheric to fight the pirate leader at the top of the crow's nest, but what does he fight you in? A mech. What does it look like? A bug. What's it called? The Grolgoth. Maybe it's super meaningful if French. I am not. Je suis anglais. It walked forward what could be done with games, but it kind of walked back what I loved about the original, which was, admittedly, the very first video game I ever saw, so this is very much a me problem. Rayman 1 might seem crude now, but it was really out there compared to what else was happening at the time. A very attractive 2D platformer that compensated in an era where everything was hopping to the next dimension by offering up its wild personality. A series of trippy events coloured by some engaging, tricky gameplay. It was very knowingly a lot of nonsense, and it revelled in it. Sure, the game starts like most platformers in the typical Forest Haven, but then throws out all decorum by making World 2 a non-Euclidean musical instrument daydream, where you fight a giant sax. Ray 2 was a funny game, but not like Ray 1. Not bonkers. And that was fine, because it meant it could continue to stand alone as an example of what Rayman could represent. This wasn't about creating a brand or a franchise, this was about showing us what Michel Ancel could provide Ubisoft. Yeah! But now we had two Rayman games serving two very different purposes, and I wasn't sure if I really wanted more of what Ray 2 was doing in perpetuity. Wouldn't it be great if we could take the strengths of both, something with the beauty of the second and the outright scope of mischief of the first? Wouldn't that be something? And you've all probably put together that it was something, and that I'm just doing a very lazy lead into what I'm going to talk about, which is Rayman 3. Hit it, Johnny. Oh shit, well that's okay, we can just recreate the feel of the song pretty easily.
Wake up, drop my coffee on the floor, knock knock, oh no, police at the door.
Ray 3 is admittedly a completely different beast. It has a new mechanical focus, a new structure, and a very offbeat tone. But weirdly, it's also entirely in keeping with the values of both of the previous titles. It's got the luscious environments and fantasy angles that were emphasized in the second, but retains the wackier humor and variation in pace and genre of the original, managing to blend the two experiences aesthetically and create what I feel is a game worthy of standing apart, adding value to all three. It's not perfect, not by a long shot, but the vibe of what it's doing is unmatched, in ways that severely influenced my tastes all over again. I don't know, once you've magically shrunk down and driven your shoe like a bumper car, there's no going back. That's sticking. Rayman 3's madness is almost immediately inherent in its new plot, with the helpful collectibles of the last game, the Lums, suddenly turning evil and stitching together sack-like outfits to become an entirely new kind of mafia-style bad guy, the Hoodlums. Yes, very good. I like that. Their leader, Andre, bent on world domination, what else, gets swallowed by Ray's pal Globox, leading to a quest to find a doctor to operate and get him out of there. Like Chase. Before Andre's minions do it the bad way, like House. The pace of the thing is much faster, the tone set pretty early on when Rayman's hands are actually pulled right off his body, forcing him to slowly build back his skill set in a tutorial that begins with you already on the move. Is it complicated? No. But it's a pace thing, and it's nice, and I like that it's there. A lot of its ideas are a bit more aggressive, not just because of the new style of gameplay, but the real swings it makes for humor, always throwing something new and crazy at you. Andre sits inside Globox's belly and forces him to drink barrels of plum juice, clearly getting him drunk and providing at least one interesting gameplay set piece, and otherwise just letting him float off, which when I was 10, yeah, funniest thing ever.
What's up down there? Can't you fly? like everyone else.
Rayman's power-ups can now be found inside these cans that create extensions of his existing abilities, the favourite being one that turns his helicopter hair into an actual helicopter hat. I think anyone who grew up with this will make a point of the psychedelic level transitions, turning these potentially frustrating skateboard sections into hugely engaging set pieces with smooth grooves. Daddy-o. For such insanity though, it's not as relentless as it could be, certainly not in the incredibly varied soundtrack. There's something about the blend of moods it catches without ever losing what I think is the core feel of all the Rayman titles. Sometimes it's incredibly delicate, commenting on the fantasy landscape in a way that's inspired, and in some cases a little ambiguous, like you're not sure how deep the power being messed with goes. Other times, it's more modern and casual, letting you know it's not to be taken all that seriously, especially concerning the more industrialized hoodlums. The clunker-junker sound of a bunch of mooks just putting this thing together and hoping it works. But all tracks have a sense of magic, an idea that whether the past or the future, it's all filtered through the light-hearted fun of Rayman's world, and giving it a grittier attitude that, honestly, slaps. Ever searched Best VGM and this is on there? Because it's always on there. I actually quite like the way all the characters come across in this. For sure, very few are integral, but it's the first Rayman game where it's kind of accepted most everyone has already been introduced. The intro level cycling through a number of familiar faces, all reacting to the situation as it happens, nobody having to sit down and give a formal handshake introduction, would only slow everything down. It sells the established world he's already been a part of that he has to save, the collective cry for Rayman to get things back to being chill, not unlike that single thumbs up from the original. Glowbox I also prefer being this way. Personally speaking, I think it's too easy to look at him and go, oh well yeah, he's going to be the big deep voice dumb guy with the heart of gold. But Glowbox in Ray 3 is a bit more of a naive child, convinced of his own assumptions, and someone who really needs saving this time around.
Open sesame! I did it! I knew it would work! I did it!
I don't think the character design is as iconic as the stuff we saw in the second, but the choices are no less inspired, also bridging the gap back to the original. The Robo-Pirates were a classic trope given a modern touch, and the new villains take the modern idea of a mafia group and dress them in a style much more suited to Rayman's fantasy. In fact, they were directly inspired by the original main villain, Mr. Dark, and unlike the pirates, who were pretty menacing, they're a bunch of bumbling goofs. The hoodlums work as a collective presence, and with the kind of bad guy design I love, taking the visual language of one species and scaling it up and down 100 different ways. I actually think this is to the other game's benefits. It makes Rayman 1 feel like a relevant part of the history again, itself featuring quite a charismatic bunch of silly bad guys who'd react to your actions, and lets Rayman 2 stand alone as the genuinely menacing presence they were, with a boss who probably would have sorted this out. And you know, a lot of other things get their due. Cages are here again, but with the little symbol wheel that always felt more satisfying than a simple number tally. Plums return with little Rayman 1 drawings, the jumping fish are back, and nothing beats the sense of dread I felt when a certain Rayman 2 enemy showed up without warning. I was 10! You can't do this. There is of course an entire level you can unlock that's a reference to the original game directly as well, so make of that what you will. Hell, even a classic move from that original game becomes, in quite a wonderful twist, an integral plot mechanic by the game's end. Ray 3 manages to take a lot of the first two games' ideas and blend them in a way that for me felt pretty definitive, allowing itself the opportunity to have fun and be funny, but also keep the more grandiose aspects of the second game intact. All the Raymans have an intense level at some point in their runtime, not just in terms of challenge, but also in their look. Either the foreboding Cave of Scops in the original, eventually leading to an encounter with the largest boss in the game, or the Cave of Bad Dreams in Rayman 2, fighting against the King of Nightmares Jarno as we experience the world in the most Frankos way possible. Rayman 3 carries on the tradition, but actually builds to it in a way that's a little subversive. After traipsing through the dark swamps, allusions are made to Glowbox and Rayman travelling to a place known as the Land of the Livid Dead. Name like that, you think, ooh, it's going to be a spooky, scary level like the other games, right?
Ah, the Land of the Living Dead, at last! In any case, it's nice and calm here. And here I was expecting a scary place filled with terrified ghouls. Oh, silly Glowbox.
Land of the Living Dead turns out to be the game's palate cleanser, a hauntingly peaceful vista where the spirits you meet seem at peace, and the soundtrack suggesting there is more right with Rayman's world than there is wrong. It massively variates the game's pace in a way I've only ever heard spoken of positively. Chances are, when people think about what they like in this game, this section is the kind of thing they think of. However, upon reaching the gate for the next world, the fellas are dropped off in the Desert of the Canaran. And it's hell.
This burns! Quick, get in the shade!
Spooky skulls, red skies, and then the cavernous bowels of the mountains, revealing Rayman's most intense enemies yet.
Spit in his eye. Skin him. Make him write bad checks.
The Canaran can't be fought, they can only be outrun, and Rayman's first encounter with them forces him into their space to try and think of a way out. No time to try anything else. The bait and switch really stuck with me, but also made me feel the variety of tones and environments in Rayman 3 that I didn't with the previous game. It's not quite as off the wall as the genre choices in 1, but it is as well paced, making what is a fairly short journey feel much more distinct with each passing location. Of course, this is just the surrounding meat, the actual bones of the game all resting on a very different kind of platformer, with a very different focus than before.
Combat fatigues! That's exactly what we need!
Rather than a strict platformer gauntlet or a free-romping collectathon, this game's a beatdown. A combat-heavy experience where Rayman uses his flying fists to take on dozens of enemies and score points based on his performance. Not entirely what any of us expected, but not an unwelcome change either. Not that there's a precedent for franchises doing this, which proves it works. Very much the opposite. Crash and Spyro both pivoted to combat in the cheaper early Activision years, and in both cases essentially fell into every possible trap. Both were horribly padded to essentially make up for the fact that their combat systems weren't particularly strong. Titans resorted to a star system that would slowly reset itself, which made certain encounters feel particularly broken, and Spyro giving you 1,000 moves and mandatory tutorial sections that made up a good 30% of the game's time, rendered useless by the fact that you don't really need them all that much anyway. No amount of Gary Oldman can fix that. Rayman's much more straightforward. The combat's fast and frantic, able to lock onto your opponents and take out most enemies in just a few well-timed hits. Never mashing buttons needlessly, but always to a very specific rhythm once you're engaged with an opponent. You can push back or get up close, and the various upgrade suits offer their own combat abilities. My favourite being the swing ability turning into a long-range electric clamp. Didn't know he was into that. Enemy variety means you're never bored either. Sure, you're facing soldiers and bombers for the most part, but when the magic wizard shows up with his banger theme song, things really step up a gear. Enemy encounters never feel like boring waves of endless hordes until the next area opens up. They're little puzzles of their own, always bringing a sense of variety and always just enough to feel manageable, or in some cases turning what you think you can do on its head. This absolutely carries over to the bosses, maybe my favourite set of bosses in a game like this. No two encounters are the same, varying not only in method, but in scale. You face a giant pair of legs attempting to squash you, then you kill the guy driving them and take complete control with running commentary.
Oh, Rayman is unstoppable today, folks. He's a real steamroller.
You meet a witch and get tangled up in a game of magic tennis over a cauldron, turning either you or her into a frog and giving chase until someone lands a hit. Hell, at one point, Rayman is challenged by a massive Canaran warrior to a one-on-one arena duel, spinning around imbued with ancient power as the soundtrack blares out what sounds like the end of the goddamn world.
You have angered the gods, Rayman!
And yet, even with all of those, there's still one guy who stands out from the others.
Unlucky and unwise is he who risks entering my domain.
Razov is still unlike any boss I've experienced in a platformer, a cat and mouse chase through the mansion of a pompous hunter who can strike without warning, either from the safety of his office or in person, chased on foot once the tables turn. It's a real character-driven event, and the kind of thinking outside the box material I always want 3D platformers to catch up with. Creating experiences where you're working through the mechanics of the characters, but having their encounters match the personalities, in ways you can't do by plopping them in an arena and coming up with avoidable attacks. Almost kind of emphasized by when they do exactly that kind of thing for a second phase. Bit of a letdown, kinda works though. There's a lot of dynamics present in Ray 3 beyond the combat, big and small, presenting what is a vibrant and often surprising world of opportunities, some as bonkers as you might expect, but others actually rather awe-inspiring. Traveling through the magical ruins of a tower, only to end up bringing that tower back from the dead and traveling through what it used to be, filled with lots of little areas and stairwells you'll be heading through in a couple of interesting ways. Razov has captured these little mole fairy things, which are all chained up around his house, that if you punch their locks, they'll thank you for being freed and leave behind some health. The hoodlums can be seen at various points goofing off on the job, sometimes without you even realizing. their equipment always laid out diegetically, so you can understand how they actually use the area. Perhaps a defining moment for me was starting this level, looking off in the distance at this enormous robotic creature slowly making its way into the ocean, framed against the darkened sky. A short swim later and the creature suddenly dives in front of me, as if it had been waiting all along. Powerful in-camera plotting like this which made me feel I wasn't just playing a scripted video game, sometimes as a kid just standing there and watching this thing take its time to disappear. Even the point system isn't just driven by how well you do in a fight or how many collectibles you get. Hunting down two little creatures in specific ways gives you little bonuses of their own too, hidden in their own crevices. Perhaps in hunting them you'll come across other secret rooms, some of them hiding some lovely Easter eggs that blew my mind as a kid. This has to be what that octopus felt like. You know, the one who kept hiding things in Mr. Potato Head and he got excited when he dug them out again. It's a life well lived, I tell you. There's thought behind this fairly tight experience, and that actually extends to the story. I mean, while nothing deep, it's still got more going on than I think I would expect from a Rayman game. The stakes shifting as things approach the end. There's not exactly a plot in the other Rayman games with much to say. Ray 2 has new ideas and characters it throws in, but nothing you won't see coming a mile off. But Ray 3 is so far the only Rayman game that weaves between characters, connecting dots in a way I kind of wish 2 did more of. The fight with Reflux would, in the other two, just be another cool stop on the journey, but what I wasn't expecting was for Andre to keep it in his back pocket to establish a new master plan, one I think might be worth seeing for yourself, given I'm spoiling just about everything else from this 20-year-old game. But I will play this clip.
Yes, Andy. Yes, Andy. Can't you say anything else?
No, Andy.
There's a lot, and it moves fast, but it does feed into some of its faults, in what is clearly not as huge a leap in technical quality as 2 was to 1. There's dodgy camera angles, a slightly stiff sense of movement, and a feeling that a lot of it was still being finalized right up until launch in a hastier way than they would have liked. And these are things I don't feel are true about the other two. I actually wonder if this is why aspects of the HD version are kind of broken. Really, it wasn't okay for so many remasters to be passed off with completely messed up textures like this. I don't know why we kept letting that happen. At the expense of being faster and more frantic, you're losing that more immersive, slower paced sense of wonder the second game offered. And if you miss points on a specific level, you're forced to go through all of them within a world again to get your rewards. It's almost an arcade-style beat-em-up. It's a smaller game, taking only a handful of hours to complete in total, which works for its clear intentions on replay value, but leaves you a little wanting for something with so much character. Of course, on that front, I think your mileage will absolutely vary. The thing about Rayman 2 that I'm not keen on is how, even though the drawings are bursting with character, the actual characters are pretty stock. There's nothing inherently interesting for me in the storytelling that makes me go, oh, the person making this has something interesting to say. Not that they aren't endearing, they're just missing some of the nuances I like about other platformer casts. Not necessarily in games with lots of dialogue either. However, I think it's that same quality which makes it more universally appealing, and is to its benefit. Rayman 2, if we're going to try and dismiss my feelings for a moment, is incredibly wise to not try and impose too much on the player. It's not that kind of game. It's very much about soaking in that look and its extremely broad characters, with a couple of curveballs thrown in to give it flavour, and let you derive meaning in between. I do think all the teensies wanting to be king is genius. They certainly don't take it anywhere, but it's not what you'll remember when you put it down. It lets the player project much more of their own thoughts onto the game, and if YouTube comments are anything to go by, people are very good at justifying pretty much whatever they want to defend. So Rayman 3 unfortunately shoots itself in the foot by being so specific, and I think it's probably worse in the English dub. Rayman is, ultimately, a French character, and I think that's very important to remember whenever you approach any dialogue or story beat in these games as an English speaker. This is a very different sensibility, and I imagine in French there are certain things that are way funnier than they are in English, which has the then ropey job of having to translate everything to not only make sense and match it to the timing of the existing animations, but to try and interpret what it believes will be funny. And I'll be honest, I think they might have done some of this game a little bit dirty.
Little grasshopper, one must never let the Canarins get near you. Capiche?
If you loved the mysterious nature of the second or the whimsical feel of the first, you're not going to enjoy Glowbox making movie references when you punch him in the tummy.
I've seen too many gladiator flicks.
You're not going to like the back and forth between the now more abrasive Billy West version of Murphy and the development team being delivered in tiny text boxes you can barely read.
I was told that after Rayman 2, I'd be cast as a tormented artist who falls for a girl with great big eyes.
You will probably cringe into your socks if you live in any time post-2020 and see this.
Oh, Robot-san.
It's that which makes it feel a little out of step with the other two, and I've had it suggested to me eons ago, it actually feels like more of a sequel to another earlier Ubisoft game by Michel Ancel known as Tonic Trouble. Tonic has an even more absurdist plot, an alien accidentally dropping a can of crazy goo on Earth, transforming everything in its path into some kind of nonsense creature, and a drunk biker into a Viking god who creates killer vegetables. It's that kind of game. There was only one reason Tonic was so absurd though, it was mostly a tech demo. This wasn't entirely intended to be a serious project of its own. The wild creativity on display was largely the result of Tonic's effort to create a 3D platformer after Mario 64, with an aim to eventually turn that into a Rayman project. Not too concerned with if the game did particularly well as a brand, and why that game plays pretty badly in comparison. Rayman 3 certainly feels like a do-over, not just because of its crazy nature, but perhaps because of the literal cans you can activate that offer wild powers, which feels like a nice way to return the favor. For all that, I understand why Rayman 3 turns off a lot of Ray purists, but I accept so much of that is down to localization, which I don't feel delivered a very polished job. I was always irritated that Glowbox doesn't even have the same voice in the pre-rendered cutscenes as the main game, especially when I much preferred the voice they went with in the gameplay.
Oh, we're gonna get to the doctors!
Rayman, I need medical attention, quick!
It's all a little too subjective to cross barriers the way the second did, and I think that gives it an appropriate standing amongst the audience, having plenty of fans, but dividing those who felt that the second one was the peak of the series.
You little pigment dog, you should be ashamed!
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
In a way, that's what I like about it. Rayman 3 forces the player into a corner, presenting them with a view of the series that's a little more complicated than the simple, peaceful world of the second, and gets much more specific. Sure, perhaps its choices are a little more crass, less palatable for the wider audience, but as someone whose first experience was the original, this was a little closer to what I loved about that, and for all its flaws, left a much greater impact. If there is some objective god out there who punishes opinions that aren't correct, then I imagine Rayman 2 is his test of mortal strength. But until I meet him, Ray 3 pushes more of my personal buttons, and that's unlikely to change. Perhaps my feeling on where the game's chaotic heart lies is the impression given by its ending, where we discover how Andre even came to be. The reason isn't some evil plot or freak of nature. It's a very deliberate act performed by something we're not even sure is alive, or thinks with its own brain, and that kinda puts a hilariously upsetting spin on things, in a way that forces the game to come full circle as you'll immediately play it all over again. 'Cause you kinda have to. It wasn't a bad guy who started this, it wasn't all the wild people you met who didn't seem to know which end was up, it was you. You did this. And you'd do it again, wouldn't you?
Rayman, quick, wake up!
I've never been too worried about what people think of the game in the long run, but there was one person who made a comment about not being on board with Rayman 3 that did pique my attention. Original creator and legendary game developer Michel Ancel, the father, essentially, of Rayman himself, and the director of his first two titles. Michel Ancel was busy at the time of Ray 3's development on Beyond Good and Evil, often considered a groundbreaking game of its own, and much more in keeping with the whimsical tone of what he was achieving in Ray 2, only from a more adult angle, concerned with then contemporary culture and broad political commentary. Again, just much easier for people to grasp. When asked about Rayman 3, he said he appreciated the work, but it wasn't quite to his taste, having only consulted on the title and feeling it was a little concrete, as well as too much emphasis on the voices rather than letting the humour come from the visuals. As you've already heard, I don't think he's entirely wrong about that. But the word concrete has stuck with me. At first I found this strange given he made Beyond Good and Evil, which in itself has a more concrete feel, but over the years I've come to appreciate what he might have meant in translation, the game's subject heavier but still carrying the same optimistic charm underneath. And really, there's no other game doing everything it's trying to accomplish. Not together anyway. It's like The Matrix meets Zelda meets Pokemon Snap. Underneath the grit is an upbeat, fantastical view of reality, and I get why those sensibilities would clash with what he felt Rayman 3 was doing. However, I do challenge the assertion purely on the basis of him never quite knowing what to do with Rayman next, and on some occasions, leaning right into 3's take. Originally, he was going to direct Rayman 4 that was sort of a free-roaming, large-scale adventure where Rayman was thrust into another random wacky world, fighting, of all things, rabbits. Rabbits that came from inside the Earth, complete with death lasers and robots and all sorts. Look nuts. He had all these different costumes, he travelled on the backs of giant animals, he fought a Star Wars reference, maybe even teamed up with Andre. It was very confusing. This was clearly designed to experiment with the then exciting new Wii console, Nintendo's attempt to shake up the market with motion controllers that would supposedly mimic your real-life moves on the screen, and the trailer they released, really went all the way with that. But fast forward a few years, and suddenly everything had changed. The huge adventure was gone, the animal riding buddies either repurposed or I believe probably squirreled away as part of another pitch he had in mind, and the rabbits had also become a little, well, different. Suddenly, the project was transformed into lowercase Rayman, uppercase Raving Rabbids, and it was obvious to all that, while this was a Rayman game, the Rabbids were the star of the show. It was now a series of minigames, the Rayman aspect just a small part of the project, while the Rabbids dominated all forms of interest within those short bursts of play, all focusing on actions you could pull off with the Wii Remote. And when the game was ported to the PC and other consoles, it became blindingly apparent that, without those waggle controls, there was just no sense of challenge at all. I actually like the sections in between where you can see Rayman's reputation improving as he wins more minigames, but with very little substance beyond that, as well as an incredibly mean-spirited ending, I can't help but feel the whole experience comes off as a little, pointless. Continuing with a much ranker sense of humour and a fairly off-putting, grungy look. You have to wonder what it was Ancel was really correcting. The GBA game that came out at the time certainly didn't follow suit with its use of Rayman 2 and 1's characters. They even got a Dark Toon in there. Quick, somebody free him. Rayman was suddenly muscled out of future Rabbid titles as they dominated the new series, including an admittedly pretty funny game about trying to get rid of them. There was some awareness there at least. And hey, maybe they were just making room for the minions. I'm not unconvinced that, if you wanted to drum up a lawsuit, they won't. But it's close. It's close. Goodwill was restored somewhat with Rayman Origins, a 2011 platformer that was clearly an effort to go back to the roots of the series as a 2D gauntlet platformer, much like the original, and invoking a lot of the first game's specific imagery in a new, super funny style that went a long way to erasing the aftertaste of the Rabbid stuff. It has to be said, the gameplay is pretty fantastic, an excellent return to what Rayman began life as, and offering something I think gave Nintendo a run for its money. I don't think you need me to go on about it the way literally everyone else did, with the same being true of the sequel too. However, again, I wonder what of Rayman 3 wasn't of use here. The sense of humour and style is much closer to what Ray 3 did, a slightly edgier tone with a couple of direct lifts from what it established, and I also wonder if Ancel really had that much of a vision for Rayman over wanting to mess about with the new UbiArt technology. You look at the original plans for Rayman 4 Post-Rabbids, again attempting to go back to the original, and the extremely long process for Origins to emerge from that, even at one point advertised to the public as an episodic series explaining Rayman's early days, and with a couple of cool plot points that got completely walked back, which feel, I don't know, a bit sloppily paved over, knowing their original intentions. Perhaps this is to its benefit, to keep it as a standalone title, and personally, I think it's good for Rayman to be driven by technology, rather than being bound to any kind of canon or logic. But I also think the slapdash approach ends up muddying a couple of its own contained ideas. How many of you thought this was Mr. Dark in disguise, and not just the magician turning bad? Because I have to tell you, officially, it's the latter. For my money, the Origins approach actually loses more of what I like about 2 than 3 does, and the sequel they created not doing much with it either, even if it was an equally strong experience. There's just too many things that I feel now you might look back on and go, I don't know if I prefer that. Don't know if I would have done it that way. Yes, even if they're
Fish people.
Perhaps this is part of why it essentially faded away, outside of a mobile spin-off which actually had an official design for Mr. Dark. That's dope, what the fuck? And while Rayman keeps popping up in surprisingly weird ways, there's still a tension around the feelings for what might have been. I mention all of this because I don't think Ancel had the right approach in doing Rayman 3 down the way he did publicly. And maybe he feels different now. Maybe that wasn't even what he meant, given that he did consult on that game. He himself has departed the industry for reasons that aren't super apparent, even if we can hazard a couple of guesses, and left a slew of incomplete projects behind, which is really the point. Whether he was facing opposition or not, I have always found Ancel's ambitions both his strength and his weakness. Projects rapidly cycling through different forms on a constant basis and often not quite sure of what they really are, unable to meet the targets he'd set, or clearly becoming distracted by new technological breakthroughs. It's what I want from an artist. I want that kind of hunger and need to aim high. There are no games like Ancel's, many of them changing things for the better, and inspiring other great artists in the business. But I don't think that makes it terribly fair to diminish Rayman 3's effort when tasked with picking up the ball, which, now knowing where else it could have gone, isn't a bad job at all. Especially the fact that it, unlike so many other Rayman sequels, actually exists. Being so terribly niche means it's going to have its extremely subjective fans, and I am clearly one of them. It's not the best of the Raymans on a cosmic level, I'll admit that, and it's not got the cleanest bill of health on multiple fronts. But it spoke to me as a weird little journey through a world right out of an animated 90s VHS adventure and was, in my book, B-coded, purple as hell. It made me think differently about how a game can feel as a structure, how something can find even more meaning from a property even after new interpretations. It was something fresh for the time, exciting, a Rayman for the 2000s, and it was, more than anything, madder.
See you in Rayman 4!
Knock, knock, oh no, police at the door. I'm doing like a Chuckle Brothers version right now. I'm like...